friends. Welcome to Season 7, Episode 289 of School Librarians United. I'm your host, Amy Harmon. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian, beginning my 18th year, I knew I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, my interview guests, and listeners who reach out to the podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions. You can reach me either on Facebook, on X, formerly known as Twitter. My handle is at LMS_United, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. And now a word from our sponsor, Capstone. Capstone is an innovative publisher and education technology provider of children's content for school libraries, classrooms, and at-home learning. Home of the award-winning PebbleGo Research Database, Capstone has a passion for creating inspired learning and intellectual curiosity in children, and I'm so excited to be working with them. I'm also grateful to Capstone for their commitment to support the podcast in Season 7. They are offering listeners of School Librarians United a very special discount. Visit shop.capstonepub.com and use the code UNITED to get $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and Capstone interactive ebooks. That's code UNITED for $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and ebooks on shop.capstonepub.com. And now for today's episode, Prepared Libraries, Empowered Teams, and my conversation with Becky Calzada, Val Edwards, and Maegan Heindel. Friends, I am so excited. Becky, Val, and Maegan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, friends, I was incredibly fortunate to have attended an incredible session at ALA Annual Conference. I met everybody who is on our panel today, except I was in the audience, and they were sitting at a table all together, celebrating this book that they wrote together. You know, friends, thank you for permitting us to include your presentation, which you gave in San Diego. I know listeners appreciate when guests share their resources because so few of us have an opportunity to travel to a national conference. And you generously shared. So thank you for writing the book. Thank you for sharing your presentation and for being here today. So let's go ahead, and I'd love to meet each of you. Tell us, where do you call home? And what is your role in school libraries these days?
I'll start off. I'm Maegan Heindel. I am living in Madison, Wisconsin, and I am currently the district library coordinator for Madison Metropolitan School District.
Fantastic. All right. And let's go ahead.
I'll go so that Becky, you can wrap us up with all of your roles. I'm Val Edwards. I live in Verota, Wisconsin, which is a western suburb of Madison. And I recently retired from my full-time position, actually as Maegan's colleague. And so I'm doing some little side things, fieldwork supervision for a couple of the universities with student teachers, that kind of thing.
So, Val, I have to ask you, you said field work, and this to me is really intriguing. I did my field work, I remember as a student teacher a long time ago in 1992 in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And then I did my field work for my library science degree in Detroit through Wayne State. But my field work, we always did a wrap-up afterwards, and our professor was really chill and said, you can meet anywhere, just make sure you debrief. And we debriefed at Chi-Chi's during Margaritaville because the margaritas were $3. And we had the coolest person who was like, that's fine. Just don't drive when you get, have somebody else pick you up. And at the time, my boyfriend would pick me up, and we're married, and we're going on 30 years now. So
there you go.
So are you one of those people who's super cool about letting your charges, all of these people you oversee meet, where it's convenient, or are you sitting in the classroom?
Well, I'm not actually in the classroom. So actually, I'm one of the people who just goes out to the site and does observations. So I'm the person at the bar with for sure.
Wow, and that's awfully generous of you to buy around every once in a while, I'm sure, right?
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Absolutely.
Wow, you are the cool one. All right, so last but not least, we've got Becky Calzada. Becky, I am so glad you're here. You've had a very busy year. So, Becky, would you go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure. So Becky Calzada, I am the District Library Coordinator in Leander, Texas. I think this year I started my 28th year in the school district. And so I've been here all of my 28 years, but I'm also actively involved in our State Library Association. I'm on the Ledge Committee there and have held some other positions. But I'm also the AASL president. I also want to say that I'm one of the co-founding members of the hashtag Freedom Fighters. And so all of the things I think that have come in my path have kind of led me to this work and to this book and to these people, these amazing people, my co-authors. And so I'm just excited to be here today to share.
The Freedom Fighters organization is absolutely inspiring. And I know a lot of us follow the Freedom Fighter work that you do on Twitter. Let's make sure that we include the Freedom Fighters social media in our show notes, because I think that would be really helpful for our listeners. And to meet you, one of the founding members, and you are our current president. And I just wrapped up an episode with Courtney Pentland, and we did a whole, if any of you friends who are tuning in would like to know what it is like to be the president of AASL, and Becky is on her journey. I did a fun conversation with Courtney, and that episode came out last week. So this would have been, I want to say, early August. So I know we're going to be, this episode will come out a little bit later. So let's go ahead and get started. Friends, you all teamed up to author a book, and I was very grateful to ALA Editions. They sent me a copy, and I had something to read on the plane flying to San Diego. So this book focuses on the importance of a team approach to defending our collections, and not coincidentally, I'm guessing, this book is a team effort with 3 co-authors. So what did each of you bring to the table as this idea became a reality?
So I'm just going to start us out and then let Maegan and Becky chime in. But it didn't start out as a book. The book is an accident that happened. Our first presentation on this topic was at ALA in Chicago. And so I had been doing work as a conflict mediator and helping with people managing conflict on teams, and wanted, as the challenges around the country escalated, I thought about what could be done proactively to help prepare people beyond knowing policies, and wanted to think about managing the internal conflict that could happen if you don't have a solid plan that's been articulated within your team prior to experiencing that outside stress. And so I wanted to get some of my colleagues to join me in that proposal, and thought people who are in districts in that position would have the feet on the ground to really know how they were implementing it and where some of those real pain points crop up. And then lucked into, at this time, I didn't know that Becky was even a candidate. She had not yet been elected, and I didn't realize that she was a candidate until after I tricked her into agreeing to be with us and doing the work. And so, so fortuitous, things just unfold. So honestly, I think asking these guys to present with me in 2023 was my biggest contribution. And then I'll let them speak for themselves in their roles.
Yeah. And so, Val reached out to me, and as I was just starting my role as coordinator, she saw on social media that I had just gotten this job. I had been a district sort of library coach role the year before. And then before that, I'd been a school librarian for a long time. So when Val asked me to do this, I said, yes, I'll present with you. And I need to hire for the library coach position. Do you want to do that so we can do this work together? Because I'm honestly going to be figuring all of this out as I take on my new role. Whereas Becky, came from a different end of the spectrum, which I think is a real strength of our team, that our experience with challenges was at a totally different ends of the spectrum. And my experience in the role was totally different as well. So we were able to speak to kind of, in the book, anyone who's at any point in that preparation for a challenge. So then Becky joined us and really brought some excellent insight.
Well, and I think one of the things that intrigued me, so Val reached out to me and said she knew me and because she'd done some work in Texas and shared that she was interested in this proposal, which I love to present and I love to collaborate. And so I think that was one of the reasons that I decided to join in. But the other, I think, biggest piece of this all was I liked the perspective that they were bringing to this presentation, because as she shared earlier, and I think, or one of you shared, whenever you go to workshops or conferences, you hear about, how to navigate a book challenge. And it's always been very individual based. And what was great about this idea for this session was it was really more about a team-based approach, very systemic, very intentional, very, spread throughout a system. And I think my contribution, being that I'm on a team of 45, librarians, and then of course we think about the people that we have to also work with, like our administrators, with our district, our school board, and that kind of thing. We had already been going through a lot of book challenges in our school district, and sometimes I often wonder if we were maybe one of the epicenter places, but we learned so much, and it's one priority for me was how do I share with others so that others can learn and they don't have to go through the challenges, the pain points that I did. So that was also an intriguing opportunity for me too.
I've got so many questions. I am so grateful you are all here being able to chime in, because I think what is amazing is you have, anytime somebody wants to take on something like, we should write a book. I'm just dying to know, are any of you published authors? I'm guilty. I should have looked this up before we started, but is this everyone's first book that you got to write? Or, I mean, any of you written a book before? Never have I ever, will I write a book? So but I'm just curious. I mean, this was everybody's first stab at being a book author. Val, have you written a book before?
Long ago, it was a series templated thing. I don't know if you remember David Lorsher with his High-Low Willow. Has that been published? I think his publication company. They had a series that was by state, and so Wisconsin Power came out as part of that series. And our DPI rep at the time, Kate Buer, and I did the Wisconsin version.
I actually didn't even know that, Val.
It was a fair number of years ago when I was just a baby.
I know we had all written articles previously for public library publications.
Yeah, same.
But for Becky and I, this was our first book.
Knowledge question. And I will say too, I know I've contributed to anthologies, but I mean, this is the first time where I think for me at least, my book is on the outside of the cover, which is kind of cool.
Yes, I think I've written a paragraph or two for a couple books, and I'm like, look, I'm on page 87. Woohoo! And that is it. All three of you are veteran school librarians, and yet many of these recommended strategies would be equally effective if implemented in a public library setting. Is that just happy coincidence, or more because of the similar tactics which are now being used by those who are initiating the challenges?
Yeah, this was really intentional for us to make our strategies applicable in many kinds of library settings. A lot of communities are seeing challenges start either in schools or public libraries and switching to the other. And so this was really intentional, as well as the fact that we all know and work with public librarians. Val was on the public library board in our community. I'm married to a public librarian. So we know firsthand of others who are facing these challenges, and we wanted to make sure that this was a resource that could be used more broadly beyond school libraries.
Well, and I kind of want to add that I think the bigger thing too is that, we may work in different kinds of spaces, but we still literally have the same kind of challenges, right? It's so literally and figuratively. That said, I think, yes, we might have different kinds of rules or policies, but we have policies, and that's what's the same. We have ways we want to communicate. That's the same. And so I think there was definitely some intersections that we could maximize. And then just as we went through the writing of this book, have the reader think through the lens of the space that they're working in and what would work for them in terms of, solving or considering ways to address a problem or a potential way to solve a problem.
So I'm realizing, and it should have occurred to me sooner, we have two Wisconsin authors, Wisconsin-based authors, and we have Becky, who's in Texas. Can I ask, did you have to factor in the regional components, or are we finding that these types of attacks on our collections and our personnel is fairly uniform across the states?
I'm going to say that definitely we've seen a lot of replication of things, and I think that's one of the tips that we give in the book is that to be situationally aware and what's going on around you, but also not necessarily close to you or your area, but what's happening across the country. Because I think one of the pieces about being proactive is being informed. So when you hear about a book, what are they doing over there? What's their tactic? What can you do here to prepare? Again, it's about being proactive. And so again, I think we're just seeing a lot of copycatting of how to have a reconsideration or what book to complain about. And so when it would happen here, next thing we knew it would happen on the other side of the state, and then the next thing would be, in Tennessee. So I think it's, everybody's trying to one up. And I think that also includes the legislation sometimes too.
I do think are these activists, these armchair activists are awfully lazy, that they're just sort of taking that playbook and rolling with it. And I credit our professional organization because we recognize that if we can compile all of these attacks and broadcast as much as we can to our colleagues across the United States, it is a way that we can at least strengthen our response, because we have sort of brought this we've curated all of these incidents of attacks on us. And I have unfortunately heard that some of this has benefited our colleagues overseas outside of the United States who have, certainly not to the same degree, but are experiencing some, at least, some efforts to try to remove titles from those collections as well.
And Amy, I kind of want to just add to that. When you mentioned, I think that's, first of all, the power of a PLN. So definitely, we can, count on that and lean on that. And then to your point about across the country, I do remember in our first session in Chicago, had somebody from Australia come up to me and was just like so, excited about what she'd learned and said, nothing's happening, but I'm going to take these ideas. And so she presented, and her supervisor was ready and they got on board, started planning. And then not 5 months later, they said they got hit but they were ready. And so again, I think it just kind of speaks to the proactiveness of, not waiting for something to happen or assuming that maybe you won't get touched or, because I think some people are like, it's not going to happen here. And we're just finding that it's happening all over the place and everybody's vulnerable. So you need to be ready.
So I've never imagined myself writing a book, and it's never going to happen. But if I had two friends on my team, I imagine that it would have made the process far more enjoyable as an experience, that we could share some of these struggles and share those victories. Can you speak a little bit to how you sort of divide and conquer? Was this a meeting of the mind? What did your workflow look like? Because this is a really big undertaking, but there are 3 of you.
Yeah, just to kick off on that, well, first of all, we are very fortunate. Jamie, last name starts with an S, our ALA editions editor, helped us have some structure to what that could look like. and helped us set up timelines so that we could navigate that around work schedules, which was actually I'm going to speak for myself. The most challenging part was having full-time jobs while we did it, and navigating all the other external things that people have going on just because we're like have a life. The value, though, was way beyond that. Having colleagues to not only commiserate with when it was tough to get the words down on paper, but also to just brighten ideas, to help with clarity, to bring a different perspective, to help find that missing idea that brought things together. Like that was just such a lovely thing. And then honestly, the depth of our connection and relationship now. I mean, I feel like this is that, in 20 years when I run into these guys at a conference or some reunion, it's going to be like, oh my God, it's like we suffered together and we triumphed together.
Agreed, definitely. This team really strengthened the depth of the content that we wrote, but also really helped me improve as a writer as well. And I definitely appreciate this team for that.
Yeah, agreed. One of the things I think, we each bring different perspectives. And while we might have been in charge of certain sections of the book, the ideas, there was just this rich, robust well of ideas to, and maybe share this, or let's add this, to expand and to give context to whatever we were talking about. So it was definitely a really, great experience. I think also too, it made this, at least for me, this first opportunity of writing not feel as overwhelming. And also I think the fact that it was a workbook versus, just a book. I also think too, what's real exciting is that, because of, we've been in this fight, intellectual freedom front lines for 4 years now. I truly believe this is going to be viewed later as a historical time, and we have something that we're leaving behind to help record how we try to support other people, other librarians. And so that's kind of a gift back to our profession.
Oh, I hope you're right. I hope you are right. And this is, it hasn't been a blip on the radar, experiencing the culture wars that really have sort of polarized the many people living, especially in the United States. You would like to think that we're going to somehow move past this at some point. I hope so. And you mentioned workbook because it's a very different kind of book. It's unlike anything I've ever read. When I read about books that address managing libraries, and it's a workbook, one in which the reader is also engaging with the content and documenting in the book itself their own relevant perspectives throughout each chapter.
Yeah, we really wanted there to be space for our reader to document their thinking throughout, thinking about ourselves and the adult learners that we support. We know that when there are big pieces of information to chew on, you need that time to stop and to reflect and to apply it to yourself. And we can provide examples and ideas, but we can't really do that application and customization for someone's team, for their organization, for their structure. So we needed people to take that time to think it through for themselves. And it really is a complex process. We shared in the introduction to the book that it doesn't need to be taken chapter by chapter. So if you're moving around in the book and you find kind of where you are in the process and take those notes, then you also have a documentation of your journey through the work to come back to later and see how far you've progressed.
I think it personalizes the reader's, experience. How many times have we been sitting and reading and we highlight something or put a little Post-it or, whatever it is we do, right? In this case, like we really wanted it to be like, oh, I hadn't thought about it like that. And then have some reflective questions where the reader thought through, like, what are the current realities of what's happening in your space versus what can you take away from what you've learned and implement or consider as you move forward.
Well, I don't need an invitation to write in the books, because when they're mine, I absolutely am conversing with you all. And that was before we had met. So it was really fun. I received your book. I was able to read it. And I love reading on the plane because I'm trapped. I can't go anywhere. And I sit there and I really dive in. But I was able to have this sort of conversation with you in the book before I saw your presentation. And I think the fun thing is that we really do engage with the content when we have a library that we love and a collection we are trying to protect and students we're trying to support. And you're writing all about this in real time, and we are sort of validating our own situation as we read your best practices. So I think that that's incredibly powerful. Page 39 really resonated with me. The heading reads, "Being Solo Without Being Alone." And I understand the importance of coalition building when preparing for an attack on our collections, but many school librarians are like me. We are solo librarians in our district. So I really appreciate that when you wrote this, you had somebody like me in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. There's all manner of different types of teams, different configurations, and people that need to be part of the process. So even as the solo librarian in your district, you need to be in communication with your administrators, your parents, your community, your kind of best bet allies, the public librarians, that type, some of that low-hanging fruit, bookstore owners, people that you can bring on board that you can assume to some extent are like-minded. But this is also just a concept that needs to be pervasive in the profession. I've always heard about how isolating it is because you're the librarian. Even if you're not the only one in the district, you're the only one in the building. And maybe it's because I'm happy to spring for a round at the bar, but I've never felt that isolation ever. So I'm always like, why? And I think it is sort of like the whole premise of the book. Like, don't sit and wait for this to happen to you, right? You have to get up, you got to get moving, you got to get out, you got to find your people, and you need to be moving forward and finding a way to do that. So for me, that's just that whole concept sort of taken this direction.
And I would add that it's really also rooted in building relationships, whether it's with the people, the teachers you serve, the administrators, the public, the community, volunteers, organizations. I think every interaction that a librarian makes is a potential relationship that could come back or kind of boomerang back to support you. And so kind of thinking through that lens in that you're building up that coalition of the and showing them about the work that you do, the role that you play, and even in sharing processes so that there's that transparency. And because we know right now that's a big target or that's a tactic that they'll say is like, we don't know how they pick books, or that there's no transparency, when in the reality it's nobody's really questioned it, nobody really asked, but you want to know, we're happy to tell you, right? So that's kind of another piece of that too.
So something that occurred to me in trying to bringing in these stakeholders, many of the when we're building that coalition, however informal it comes together, and rallying the troops, the people who are going to support us. I also recognize, at least in my personal experience, that it would be one has to tread lightly, because alerting the troops, as it were, would be the issue is that as employees who are on payroll, we have to be very delicate about how we use whatever method to broadcast the issues that we are experiencing, at the risk of jeopardizing our jobs. I'm just thinking out loud, because I know that when there have been some people who have chosen to use their school social media to broadcast the things that are happening, they have come under the microscope and have, at the very least, been reprimanded or admonished for having broadcast using the school megaphone to do it.
Right. I think I want to say to that absolutely we have to be mindful of that, and I think that's important. I also think, though, that there's a professional way to navigate conversations about staying informed, and reminding people about what the purpose of these tools are, if it's email and what we use it for, or if I want to communicate about here's a new policy that we're implementing or new processes and that kind of thing too. And then I also think the other piece of it too is that sometimes if there's a problem, I often wonder, is it really kind of rooted in the emotions, the scuttlebutt, the he said, she said? And so to that, I would say always remembering that we're professionals and, asking myself, is that something I would want to have broadcasted all over? Would I be comfortable with that? And so there's confidentiality rules that are important that we have to be mindful of. And I know throughout this process, never did we say, oh, this person said this or that. I mean, we might have cited examples of simple, but we never said anything about a person's name, or even if it was a male or a female. We just said incidents like this could occur, and it's really kind of rooted in not just maybe things we've seen, but really more about things we've seen outside or heard about. And I think that's one of the things that I tend to hear more about too, supporting with Freedom Fighters, because again, there's that network piece. And so even a solo librarian that's feeling overwhelmed might reach out and say, I just need a person to lean on. And I've had that oftentimes in my role as a coordinator, an outside person that doesn't have a district director or coordinator. And I don't mind helping a person like that, because I mean, my thinking is if they are making the time to seek out and ask for some support or questions or ideas, I need to make the time, because there's obviously an urgent need, and I think that just takes a lot of courage to say, I'm just going to ask and see what happens. I'm a nothing to lose, all to gain kind of person, and that could be a critical opportunity for somebody to learn something new, to how to approach or what to do or what kind of steps to take.
And Val and I actually experienced firsthand the question of whether and how to communicate with the public about our processes and how to tread lightly, like you said, when a reporter from our local paper asked us to speak to our selection process. And we weren't sure kind of what his purpose was for writing the article or his angle. And that was when we say in the book that you need to know your process for communication. You need to know your systems, who needs to be consulted in your district. Your communications department is someone who probably needs to be brought in to help you vet what you're going to share and know what is okay to say, what's not okay to say. So I spoke with our legal department. I spoke with many of our communications staff. It went through all of my supervisors. Val and I had lots of conversation about what the content of that would be. I prepared answers. I was given questions in advance. And ultimately, I was able to give really common sense, kind of no-nonsense answers to the questions, just saying, yes, we do have policies. Like Becky said, being proactive and saying, we follow guidelines. We will answer your questions. We want you to ask questions about what your kids are reading. Actually, we would love for you to be engaged in what your kids are reading. And so we were able to ultimately, have a really successful article, I think, that I hope put some people's minds at ease when they think about, how books are getting into their students' school libraries.
I'd also say, Amy, this is exactly where, if this isn't when you just first start posting on social media and you have a background of having posted valuable information to your colleagues, your community, your students, you've already built some trust there. And this isn't an unusual experience that now you're under duress. You're maybe not at your best. You need to be able to take some time and space to take care with what you're saying. But if this is something that's not unusual in your practice, if you have the luxury of planning ahead on this piece and you're not now in the midst of something as it comes to you. This is where you start building those relationships. So you have some trust built, you have some history there, and people aren't going to be like, oh my God, for the first time in 10 years, Val posted something on her social media and it's a little inflammatory. Like, that's not going to be the first time you hear my voice. Then we're all going to be better off and better able to take it for what it's worth.
It's like the track record's already kind of laid.
Right.
They understand like who she is in terms of representation of her, where she works and that kind of thing too. And I also want to add that what I love about even the, working with your media department, with your administrators is, again, you're strengthening that relationship. I think everybody brings a level of expertise, and it just takes one wrong thing to say and it gets everything escalated, right? And so when you're able to even coach your media team to say, we can't say this and this because this will cause a friction, or this will cause people to think you're taking a side. Like, how do you ride the middle? Because I think that's the unique thing about any kind of questions around intellectual freedom. We could have the everyday receptionist answer the phone call from a parent that's just, worried about like, oh my God, my student read da-da-da, insert whatever. And then a receptionist, oh, that sounds terrible. Let me get you to the library, versus saying, let me pass along your concerns to the librarian so there's just a difference in approach, right? So thinking about all the layers of possibilities, because one wrong move and you've got people that are for intellectual freedom saying, why are they, counting down to that? Or the ones that are not feeling heard saying, why are you only pro? So we have to find that middle ground and help people understand about the work that we do.
I met my brand new principal today, and whenever you meet your new administrator, you kind of want to know, what are you getting? And he was very candid in saying, I don't like surprises, so I would appreciate a heads up when you know something's coming. All right, and I would like to have some idea that I'm going to be getting an angry parent call before the angry parent calls, and to that effect. And we owe our immediate administrators that courtesy, because oftentimes the angry community member is not thinking to call us first. They usually go to the superintendent. They usually go to the principal, because, why would you talk to the librarian when you can, start making demands of a superintendent or the principal? I love when we talk about a prescribed toolbox, because the more I think about a toolbox as a metaphor, I'm like, a toolbox is not something you put together in an emergency. The toolbox exists in advance, prior to the emergency. And this makes all the sense of the world. I'm just kind of looking at the word with fresh eyes, because I'm like, oh, it's a toolbox. Oh, you have to have this ready before you need it. And that's like you just having this sort of moment. Having the policies and procedures in place prior to the being challenged is sort of like owning a, backup tire before you have a flat. It really doesn't do you any good if you buy the tire after you've had the flat. I realized while attending your session at ALA that I have considerable homework myself, thanks in large part to the detailed toolbox, which you have assembled in anticipation that somebody will be reaching out either directly or indirectly about issues and content in our collection.
That's right. But I also want to make sure that we point out that it's never a process that's completed in assembling your toolkit. And so if you have already faced a challenge, if you have already gone through a really stressful situation, it is not too late to reflect and continue to put those things in place. Speaking, personally, we have not faced, in my time in Madison, I'll say yet, a formal challenge. Having written this book, I know more than anyone the need to have these things in place, and yet I also don't have the power to set the timeline for my Board of Education, right? So many of us are in that situation where those policies are something that we need to work on in collaboration with other leaders in our organization. And so looking at what we can manage in that toolbox, what we can control, and Val and I could control building out some more detail in our procedures, in our departmental procedures that build on the policy. So the policy still is the existing policy that, we could improve on, but we also have what we have. And so I just really want to emphasize that people, when they look at our book or they hear us talking, I hope that they know that we don't think that we have this down perfectly either, or that we're done, that we're complete in this process. In fact, true story, you may have noticed I was writing something as Becky was talking. That's because I was remembering, oh yes, I want to make sure that at a PD session in November that we co-create an FAQ for selection to put on our library website, because we don't have that yet. And I need to make sure that I then send some of those talking points to our principals this year. So, this is still constantly a work in progress and needing revisions.
And so hopefully the book provides some of that like inspiration or mentor ideas, but then also too, it would be my hope that people say, and yes, and maybe this, right? So like I think about the FAQs. I remember when we wrote our FAQs, but there wasn't that idea. While we have that in place in our school district, it happened in Texas because so many of us were kind of experiencing those things that started happening. So for me, it was about, let me look around and see what FAQs are out there and what can I pull and maybe adjust for our school district, or maybe add because here's something that relevant that came up, while also maybe, because we have a large team, pulling from our librarians and saying, if you could, tell the community certain things, what would those important things be? And so we're kind of compiling ideas, and maybe we're not going to have a 100-question FAQ, but we're going to list them all and kind of prioritize and say, what are the most important? What are the ones that you think you navigate most? Because we all want to be on message as a group, as a team, but then directing our administrators and saying, come look at our FAQ, what is there that, that you could help to inform you? Maybe it's creating this is how we select books in our school district kind of document, which we did, rooted in our policies, but also in being very more transparent about, and we use these kinds of reviews, and we also take in public input, or, just whatever those processes are. So again, that we just really wanted to be transparent and address the whole, you don't tell us how you check out book or how you select books. This whole like perception that we are trying to do harm, that was definitely something we wanted to, move away from and help everybody understand that, what the purpose of our work is and what our goals are for our programs.
If we're talking about something like challenges to our collection, I would have to be more reliant on common sense and how that would drive me and the questions that I would respond to, just because if you don't have as much firsthand experience, you may have to sort of try to anticipate what the general public might want to know. I know my students have questions all the time, not coming from a mean place, but just like a curious place. Teachers too, teachers ask all the time, and you're like, okay, well, if my teachers have these questions, I can well imagine the general public also has these questions as well.
This is where I'd also definitely lean on others in your community who have been through something similar, and have them supply some of the questions that they were asked as they went through a challenge process. That's one of the strengths of that coalition.
I also think too that you could ask, this isn't necessarily, questions about resources aren't necessarily something that's specific to libraries. So there's always questions about processes for instructional materials, the purchase of them, how you vet them, where you get them from, all that. So how do you maybe bring some of those kinds of procedures or over to the library lens? and again, in a way that's more transparent, that still aligns with the policies you have in place, whether it's for your school district or even within the parameters of your state laws and that sort of thing too. I mean, I think there's definitely things that could help to build and enhance what goes on in a school library in a way that, again, just builds transparency and builds trust, because I think that was the big thing is like, there's just this whole, like, we don't trust the librarians thing. You can trust the librarians. So, and this is why. And then here are the documents to kind of tell about that.
Well, and Becky reminds me that many of us work in districts where the materials and what we have in our libraries are included not so much in library-specific language, but rather in more of an umbrella for instructional materials. And it's been my experience that this is not ideal. It's far from ideal. Our administrators will say, we've got you covered, Amy, because we have a sort of blanket or an umbrella policy that addresses instructional materials. But librarians will tell you that library books are not, they may sometimes be instructional materials, but that's not always the case.
Well, and it's a different process. And I also think, too, it's a different kind of space. And so I think the thing that people, or many don't understand, that a school library is a space of voluntary inquiry. It has materials where people can come in, research on their own, read what they want. And yes, it's curated in a way that if it's elementary, is for maybe pre-K to 5, it's a middle school 6 to 8, whatever the spans are, right? But I think where the misunderstanding comes from, I think there's this perception that in a library, a student's going to read all of the books, and without the understanding that in a high school collection, there could be 13,000 pieces of materials and maybe even more in the digital content. And there's just no absolute way that's going to happen. And then let's just not even talk about the fact that sometimes like we're just trying and working hard to get those high schoolers to come in and read independently but they're so involved in all the academic stuff, sports, all the outside stuff, right? I think that message gets forgotten because yes, you're right. It's a different vetting process, although yes, they could be used to support. But again, and this is where I think good conversations with your teams are important, or with staff, is that, no student, I tell our librarians all the time, you should never be telling a student they have to check out a book. That goes against the whole premise of a library. Nobody's forced to check out a book, so it also is a great way to tell our teachers, because sometimes teachers want to, you have to get this kind of a book, or you have to get this kind of a book, or you can't get this kind of a book. They have to remember that in the classroom, they get to decide what the student reads for their assignment or their essay, whatever those things are, right? Libraries are different. And so I think that's that opportunity to kind of talk about the space being about voluntary inquiry. And if you don't want to come in, that's okay too.
I want to say that again, a space of voluntary inquiry, because when students come into our spaces, we aren't assigning them to anything. Nobody is holding a cattle prod over this student and saying, you will read this now. They're not being compelled. And so to place the same burden that you would say on a classroom text that everybody is reading out loud together, it's a completely different conversation that you're having. And you shouldn't hold the library to the same standard that you do in a classroom setting, where the dynamic is certainly very different. So page 60 is a favorite of mine. The table of phrases that facilitate or escalate communications. It's absolutely genius. I needed to rehearse these because I know how one responds when confronted with an accusatory email or a hostile encounter will likely impact the likelihood of an altercation or exchange that resolves itself or that escalates. And I was lucky enough last year to attend a de-escalation training. And the only reason I got to go is because I had actually approached my administrators, plural, and said, never have I ever received de-escalation training. I would like some now, please. As somebody who now deals with, and for us, it's a smaller school, but in Texas standards, but 1,350 kids. I need this kind of training. because oftentimes using certain words to respond may generate a big response or no response. And you guys did this clever sort of, 2 columns. And I really was looking at this going, I needed this about 10 years ago. Thank you very much.
And I think sometimes this is the stuff that unfortunately maybe you might learn when you go to a counselor. I don't know. I know I did. I learned early on, like, you should never start a sentence with you, insert whatever happened. So I think, I love the phrases because I think it opens up ideas for how to approach, whether it's a conversation in person or if it's in written format, just kind of considering, the demeanor you want to, present. I think we forget that when there's a lot of emotion, it's easy for it to just get out of control. And does it take a strong, steady, like, internal strength? Absolutely. It's funny because this actually just happened. We had a question about a book just the other day, and the librarian was really upset about it and I think some of it was not necessarily a book she purchased in her library, but it was just very personal to her because this was a book that's in her collection. And I tried to, kind of talk to her a little more, and she did calm down, and she's like, "You're just always so calm." And some of that I attribute to, I've had a lot of practice, which it helps, but also the same token too, I think what I've also learned just in my experiences, whether it's in my personal life or my professional life, is that when you're in that emotional space, you're not going to be as open or receptive to listening. You kind of are, either downshifting because you're just, thinking about the next answer, or you're just so angry that you can't think straight. And so hopefully that what we shared here gives people ideas, because I think, while we're talking about them in the context of a book challenge, it's okay to say, tell me more, for all kinds of things that might be happening, because maybe you just want to understand more than you know. So these could also be used beyond just in the context of intellectual freedom or book challenges.
In the book, and this is such I read this and reread this, and it really resonates. You wrote, quote, "We have a pathway. You do not need to blaze a trail," end quote. I am not speaking from personal experience, but I am guessing that it would be very easy to feel singled out when being confronted with a challenge, and yet you and your team have, in this book, spelled out a pathway going forward.
Yes, and I think some of it's just, again, to the experiences that we've had, and because we have seen similar things happen across, I just don't think that there's a need to reinvent a wheel. How do we, again, connect as a PLN, as colleagues, to just say, this is how we dealt with this. This is how we addressed this concern, or these are some procedures we used, or maybe it's, here's some draft responses we used, because I think that's another thing, because again, and I'm speaking for me, in my case, we've gone through a lot of those challenges with the community, within the community. I've had other, not even just librarians, administrators reach out and say, I was told that you could help me consider some things. I think that's great, because shouldn't we be helping one another and learning from one another? I think we do that already. Administrators go present to other administrators and learn from them. What I'd love to see more of is more of that cross-pollination. Like, I'd love for an administrator to invite their librarian to their administrator conference, so that then we're all talking about how we worked together in a united front to share what our lessons learned were, what our proactive steps were that worked, and that kind of thing. And maybe even let's throw in a board member. And I say that because I'm fortunate enough to live in a community where our board members believe in our policies and want to follow our policies. And it's not just because it's the library. They want to follow all policies, right? So it's not about them singling out about pro-intellectual freedom or not. It's about, regardless of what's happening, we always want to uphold our policies. And if our policy says we have to do this, then that's what has to happen. And so they're just backing us up.
I was just going to say, speaking of policy, I know that when I get the opportunity to present some ideas for updating and enhancing our policies, that I have a lot of districts nearby and far flung that I'm going to reach out to because they have created that pathway. They have worked through challenges with that policy, so it's tested. And I also feel that my leadership is going to be receptive to ideas when I can say that these districts used these policies and had positive results and felt like it was a clear and strong policy. So, absolutely we'll follow the pathways that others have created as well.
And one more thing to that, too, when you spoke about that, I remember early on, we used to have, one of the things that came up in our situation is that we were purchasing a lot of classroom libraries, which is kind of what started everything. But yet there was no policy to address how those were vetted. And then what we found out is that, so our school board wanted something, but there was really no mentor text for that. And so I'm going to put in a plug for the Office of Intellectual Freedom, because I reached out and said, do you have any mentor policies that separate the classroom purchases that might be library books, kind of library types of books, from library books in a library? So, and they were really helpful and shared several from across the country. And I know our school board was really grateful for that, because we didn't have anything like that in Texas at the time. So we were literally, cutting the grass on that trail. But now, our state has addressed that. And one of the things we found is that it was actually helpful to separate them, because when you're talking about instructional resources in a classroom, I think you want to have content experts that are there at the table. And when it was under our umbrella, there was not going to be a content expert under there, which is detrimental, because I'm not going to claim to know everything about social studies. I may know some, but I'm not going to have that deep, rich well of experience and knowledge like our social studies curriculum directors are going to have. So
we've mentioned several times that this process is invariably going to involve our administration, be it a principal, assistant principals, and the idea of educating them in a way that doesn't make them at all feel like they are somehow ill-informed or unprepared. I will be very honest. I looked at the Michigan Association of educators, leadership, or principals, whatever the organization was called. I was like, I'd love to present to you, because these are principals. I mean, could you imagine a school librarian and crashing a school principal conference? And unfortunately, the criteria for the presenters was you had to be a member of the organization. And all of a sudden it was like, the only way this is going to work is if I collaborate with an administrator and we get in that way. And I'm not trying to do anything underhanded, but I just think about, isn't this, we as school librarians have gone out of our way to include the administrators in our conferences. I know at the state level, it's not unusual if you invite your administrator, the administrator doesn't pay any sort of registration fee whatsoever. And furthermore, a lot of state organizations have awards that we give to a supportive school administrator for the work that they do to support and provide us the type of encouragement that we need to do our jobs, despite whatever comes our way. And yet, where's my invitation? I want to go to their conference, and I really think at some point, a principal needs to wake up and say, maybe it's my turn to bring you to a conference of mine.
No, Amy, you need to wake your principal up and say, we need to do this together. And actually, you need that partnership, because if you get there on your own, they're not going to listen to you as well as if one of their peers is standing next to you. So I did this with an AP one time. And basically, it was like, sir, you may sit there and I will stand here talking, but you were my ticket in. And I mean, which is basically what happened. It wasn't quite that clear cut, but it was, the essence of it was like, I'm going to plan this. Here's where you let me know when you're going to chime in, but that's how you get in. And that's just the direction it flows right now. And until I think if more of us do that and say, dear admin, it's you and me at your conference, friend, that's when the audience is going to realize they do want to hear from us and that it is valuable. But until we're there, they don't know why they would invite us.
I will say one of the things that we did, because we ran across that rule here in Texas, our state organization actually decided to go get a booth. And so we were in their exhibitor booth. And so our school library division partnered with the state organization so that we could split the costs. And so we got a booth and we got some really nice banners and asked me about how to navigate a book challenge. And so it was really kind of an amazing experience to have. So, got to look for different ways, right? Different possibilities.
Well, and even from an advocacy perspective, how many of those administrators are going to scratch their heads and say, oh, wait, who's my school librarian? Oh, I don't have one. I really hope that listeners are tuning in going, okay, note to self, we've got a school year coming up, and maybe I'm going to find myself getting invited to an administrator conference. I challenge you. I know it's on my list. I think that would be absolutely fantastic. And I know when I left, I was in the Tampa airport flying home to Michigan, and across from me was a friend of mine. I'd interviewed her because she won her library received School Library of the Year from AASL, and next to her was her principal. And her principal was also being recognized because so much of this depends on having a supportive administration. And I was like, hey, your principal got to go to Tampa because of the library and the librarian.
It's been my experience both as a teacher and librarian and now in this leadership role that for the most part, I think principals want their librarian and the rest of their staff to be successful, but they often don't know how to do that. They probably have gotten little to no training on the role of the librarian. Oftentimes evaluating them is challenging because they don't know what they're looking for when they go into a library. And I had the experience just this last week of being in a leadership meeting for the district launching our school year and spending maybe less than 3 minutes talking to a high school principal. And we were just doing a connector and we just spoke for 3 minutes. And he said, oh, wow, I want to talk to you. I really want my library to be the center of the school. Can you help me envision how that happens? And I think, yes, when we start from a place of assuming that maybe they don't know rather than they don't care or don't value, I think that we can then build on those relationships and be those advocates in a much more positive way.
Or even wait for them to come and ask. I think that's another thing. I hear well, they don't reach out. And I'm like, well, but why did they have to reach out first? And so any kind of opportunity. So, Amy, I heard you earlier say you had a new principal. We hire principals different times of the year and not necessarily at the beginning of the year, and they're not there at the start. And so one of the things I tell our school librarians to do that are on board that might have a new person, say, reach out, either email, send them a little note. So excited to have you here. Welcome. I'd love to talk to you about the library at your earliest convenience. It's just a little like whatever those entries are, because I think people remember, that feeling that when they're welcomed, and then you just leverage opportunities. For me, it's interviews. When I'm interviewing with the principal, because that's part of my role, I help them to build an understanding of what the possibilities of their school library could be with that new person in that space. And so every time somebody leaves, we keep raising the bar because we want a little more. And so again, leveraging those interactions, whatever with administrators, I think, you just don't miss an opportunity.
I started this week with a potted plant in a hand and just waltzed down to the main office. I said, I just wanted to say welcome to the school. I look forward to working with you. Here's a potted plant. I see you're on your way to a meeting. I will connect with you later when we both have a chance to talk. That was it. And you know what? It works. It honestly does. So I'm so curious. I was reading your book, and I never thought we'd talk about a postmortem in the library, except in this context, it makes so much sense. You recommend in your book conducting a postmortem, an autopsy, if you will, on the challenge that happened and how it played out. Would you share with us the timing of this and why it is so incredibly valuable to the process?
Well, it can start immediately, really. And I tried to coin the term pre-mortem also. So you can anticipate so many things right out of the gate, right? Part of watching what's happening in other places, part of the casual conversations that you have maybe with your students and teachers about what's going on and what's in your collection. You can anticipate what a response is going to be to something you say. But in the book, we did a specific postmortem, and there were a lot of lessons learned from that. A lot of, in that instance, particularly luck that helped us have positive outcomes. And it's a guide now for being more intentional and aware going forward. So in that instance, and it's interesting the things you talked about with your admin not being caught by surprise, etc. In that instance, I got a phone call. And in the interest of not having my administrators be surprised, I did this to my administrator all the time. I secretly called him Uncle Paul. I would go in and I say, I need to tell you the thing I just did. So it was just our relationship, which happily for me. But when I told him, what I discovered is many people had gotten that phone call from that individual and no one had responded to it until I responded to it, which explained the level of frustration I encountered when I was having our conversation, which prompted a lot of escalating anxiety, frustration, and annoyance, I'll just confess, in me. And so those are the kinds of things that as you discover them and have those conversations, and then when I said to administrators, like, this is my job to have this conversation, the relief was palatable. I mean, he was just like, thank God it's not me, and then we could move forward from there. But, you're going to have made mistakes. It's horrifying now in retrospect to think of how narrowly disaster was averted, because truly, if I had had that experience as a citizen in the community, making that phone call, getting the brush up so many times, I'd have started talking to my friends and I'd have believed the ideas that had prompted me to have questions and tried to get answers to start with. So you really have to dissect those experiences and see, where did the grace come in that helped us move in a good direction and end on a positive note, and how close, what led us into the danger zone and how can we avoid that?
And I think reflection is just always a good thing because it helps you to improve your processes. I know when we were going through all of this, one of the things that really got us to do a lot of postmortem or reflection was having to navigate nearly 20 book challenges that we had to complete in 2.5 months so that we could get some CARES funds. Nothing whips things or, creates more efficiency or, updates or additions than going through a review process and you keep hitting a wall on the same question and the committee's like, this doesn't make sense here. So what do? We fix that because that was more a question for maybe nonfiction material or textbook, because at the time it was like we had one form for all kinds of things, library books, textbooks, all the things, right? So I think, again, that reflective process helps you to adjust, not because you're changing the rules midstream, but more just you're saying, like, we've adjusted this because it addresses this, concern that keeps coming up, or this question that keeps coming up.
The idea of being empowered really resonates with me. And I know other school librarians want to do everything we can do to fend off these attacks on our collection. I would like each of you to share how writing this book has helped you as we school librarians, especially here in the United States, are navigating these particularly difficult times.
So for me, I think what's helped is that just sharing the things that I learned and making connections with people that maybe learned those same things or were open to the ideas, I hadn't thought about it in that way. I think this book, we all are sharing this common bond of that we're navigating either challenges or trying to be prepared and learning from each other. But I think what's empowering is that I like, somebody said earlier, I, as an individual, may not have all the answers. And what's empowering is that there's a resource that can help me understand what some potential ideas are. And by no means is it the only well of information, but it's one resource that somebody can lean on.
I would say that maybe a surprisingly simple but impactful realization is that as librarians, our selection policy is so foundational to this whole process, and that no matter your level of control or leadership in your organization, that you can be empowered to know your selection policy, follow it, and speak on it eloquently. If you can do that, then you are so much more further ahead than you might think. Whatever the organizational structures or the policies, you can tell somebody why. This is something that I think Val really instilled in me in working with her, is if you need to be able to say what's on your shelf and why you put it there. And when you know your selection policy well, and you know why you select what you do, you're not only using your funds wisely and building a collection that's going to be engaging and intentional, but then you can speak to a question confidently when it comes up.
I would say that in terms of writing the book, for me, and again, I initially brought that conflict mediation lens. This applies so far into the practice of librarianship beyond addressing challenges. It's about seeing our connectedness, learning from each other, understanding that these things have broad application and that there's a lot of depth of resource that we can draw from. And that just fighting like what seems like almost a foundation of the profession, which is that we must function in isolation, and just turning that on its side and saying, no, we have so many people that we touch through our practice and so many colleagues that we can relate to. And I think it just brought this home more, the way that the relationship amongst my co-authors and I evolved, the opportunities we've had to connect with people as a result, the way everything just unfolds reinforces everything about communication and relationship building and understanding your practice that's in the book, and takes it so far beyond.
I'm so grateful you three have been able to share all of this experience with us about writing the book, and especially because I was able to meet you all firsthand, read your book, and see your presentation in person. Listeners will no doubt want to follow you and add you to their PLN. Would each of you share with us the best way to follow you or reach out should we want to contact you directly?
I'm happy to lead off. This is Val. Having been retired and doing some little dabbling things on the side, my greatest presence truly is in LinkedIn right now, which is not a huge, vibrant library community necessarily, but I am also including my email, and I am thrilled to be in touch with people and talk about all things library anytime.
Perfect. And then I'm on X as at AASL president, because I did leave X when I was on there. So you can follow me there for that year and connect there. But I'm also on Bluesky, so at becalzada.bsky.social, and I'll put it in the show notes too, so we can follow. So I'm also on LinkedIn too, so I can put that there too.
No, that's absolutely wonderful. Again, everybody has a place where they feel most at home, but we also have to recognize that not everybody speaks the same social media language or prioritizes them the same way. So I'm so grateful. We've got, this amazing group of school librarians and leaders who have chosen to apply themselves in a way that we can all benefit. Thank you so much for creating this workbook for us to be able to use. I hope you have a fantastic year as we move into the fall year. And thank you so much for sharing of your time.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thanks, Amy.
Friends, you don't want to miss the full presentation which Becky, Val, and Maegan so generously shared, linked in today's show notes, and consider buying their book, a workbook which will walk you through all the steps necessary to make sure that you are a prepared library and your teams are empowered. If you found this episode helpful, please share it out with your team, your PLN, and on social media. Be sure to follow on your favorite podcatcher so you'll never miss an episode. And if you really liked listening today, consider leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help others find us. Use the code UNITED to take advantage of Capstone's generous $20 discount off an order of $100 or more. See the link in today's show notes. Next week's episode is all about advocacy and staffing for our libraries with school librarians. The topic of our next episode will be Restoring Philly School Librarians, and my conversation with Corrine Bradley, Deb Grill, Jenny Lohman, Deb Cockle, and Barbara Stripling. I hope you will tune in.